At some point when growing up, you probably would have heard a story of a knight who defeats a dragon to rescue a princess. A fine story of dragon slaying, but alas, the original version of this story, or at least the original version from a Proto Indo European perspective, point of view around 6,000 years old or so, well, that didn't have knights, or dragons, or even princesses. Now, some psychologists say this story of dragon slaying evolved from a man trying to battle his own demons. He's inside his head, his inner self. But I have to say, I'm not overly convinced by that, as instead, hidden away behind the Proto Indo European creation myth, a myth that involves two characters, man and his twin, Manus and Emo, behind this, there is another story. See, behind the first man and the second person, a twin, there is a third person known back then as Trito, which literally means third in Proto Indo European. And it is the story about him that I believe became the myth we know today, in which a knight slays a dragon to rescue a princess. And this video is going to look into this. So, welcome to the story of the Dragon Slayer, and welcome to Crickenfold. So first, a little background is required to understand where this myth grew from. And this will be a synopsis, really a simplification, but it will allow you to grasp the seeds of why what happened. And for those of you who are regular viewers, you may know this and you can skip this part using the chapter links below in YouTube. But for those unfamiliar with the Proto Indo European myths, let's go back in time around 8,000 years or so. And at this point in history, the early European farmers, sometimes referred to as EFFs in academic papers, they arrived in the Russian steppes from Anatolia, and they reduced the need for hunter-gathering by introducing farming. And once in the Russian steppes, where the land was fertile and really suited for farming, it allowed that culture to develop. With this, so did their use of technology, and over time they started becoming very effective at farming, looking after cows, riding horses, and in time developed the wheel so it could be used for transport, and thus allowed continued expansion of farming and trade and war. Now, the language these people spoke was called Proto Indo European. It was a language, not a culture. And many of the other tribes and kingdoms around them wanted their knowledge. They wanted the technology. These people possessed things they wanted. They admired them. They thought their gods were better than their own because they were more successful. And so, through trading with them, talking with them, that Proto-Indo-European language spread. And so, it evolved to the languages we come to today, west across Europe and east into Persia and India. And with this language came stories, there came beliefs, and some key aspects from that original culture. And this is why many Indo-European religions and stories can be traced back to these times and to this region of the Russian steppes. Now, one of the stories that was spread is the creation myth of the Proto-Indo-European religion. The myth that I said in the introduction was from where the dragon slaying myth would grow from. And we know this because the creation myth has been reconstructed. And I've talked about this reconstruction in many videos on my channel, including this one here. And I would also recommend that anyone interested consider reading David Anthony's book, The Horse, the Wheel and Language. I'll put a link to it in the description, like details of it. And he has an example of the creation myth in here too, which is in the start of chapter 8 for those who don't want to read the whole book. And so behind this creation myth lies some of the answers to the origin of the Dragon Slayer. And so I'll tell you the Proto-Indo-European creation myth in brief, so it's easier to understand where this third man that I mentioned in the introduction comes from. So in the beginning of the cosmos, two beings were created, Manus and Emo. Manus meaning man, the first man, and Emo meaning his twin, or two. But also with them was a giant cow in which they suckled for milk to give them strength. Now, Manus wanted a home, wanted order and wanted to stop wandering through the cosmos, and so he killed Yimo. From this sacrifice from Yimo's body, Manus created the gods, the sky god, the storm god, the ocean god. From the body parts of Yimo, Manus also created the earth, and then man. Manus came down to the earth as a priest figure, and he taught to man that through ritual sacrifice, he would keep the world in order. And so, within this story, Manu represents a priest figure who comes to earth to teach man about ritual sacrifice, and the twin, Yimo, is a representation of a king, someone who must be willing to sacrifice themselves for the greater good of everyone else. As I said here, in order for the world to be created, and with this world in place, the pieces are in place for the creation of man. Now, these myths the creation talks about come with three classes of men: sovereigns, warriors, and commoners. And this is all well understood, well sort of established view, and one that Dumezil puts forward, saying that as time went on, as these myths evolved, these three classes would change into three tribes. And this is seen in some forms of the myth. For example, in the Germanic myth, the writings by Tacitus with the three tribes of Manus are noted as being the Ingavones, the Herminones, and the Istvaones. And additionally to this, we mustn't forget the cow, or the ox. It is from this bovine that all animal and vegetable species would come. And from these parts, we see that this creation myth was of fundamental importance to our ancestor societies. The myth of Manus, the first man, and Yimo, the twin, the king, but the myth of a warrior also seems to fit within this story, as the warrior's name is often Trito, or a cognate of this, and this means third, in effect creating three primordial heroes: man, twin, third, all of whom serve as models for different social groups within the early proto-historic cultures. Now, the myth of the warriors is not a new discovery. These myths have been well known for millennia, well known to our Indo-European ancestors. And stories are known from East Africa to Greece and from Scandinavia to India. But these myths seem to have two distinct flavours. There's one type that tells the slaying of a serpent or a dragon, and there's another type about raiding cattle. Now, these tales may seem unrelated, but part of our journey here is to uncover why there are two myths, and why the split or this evolution. Now, if you want to read any stories of slaying dragons and monsters, then include in your reading list Beowulf, which is a Scandinavian myth with the monster Grendel, a human-like monster. And translations of this epic have to decide whether you read something that is an accurate literal translation, or a translation that sort of contains the poetic presence of alliteration, or in other words, a poem that feels like the original is being read but in a more contemporary English form. And for noting, the most enjoyable version I've read lately is Liuzza's version, which I have here, which is more on the poetic side. If, however, you want to understand the story, each character, where they appear in a variety of old manuscripts and writings, then I would recommend reading Beowulf and its Analogues, which is translated by Garmonsway, Simpson and Davidson. Not only does it sort of discuss the appearance of the characters in the story in other pieces of medieval literature, and has a translation of Beowulf at its front, it also contains chapters on other dragon-slaying myths and man-like monsters, which is a highly informative read. Really recommended. But there are other stories. Travelling east, we have the Mesopotamian Marduk slaying Tiamat from the Enuma Elish, and I've made a video of this, which I'll link here. And my video version is worth a watch, I feel, because it includes information from more recent archaeological findings. The best translations otherwise are from before these discoveries, and before that, before who we realised Tiamat really was. And when you realise this isn't a dragon slayer myth, which we recognise by the end of the video I'll show, but it does show the evolution of how myth changes and how it's perceived. And another tale you might want to read, especially if you like Egyptology, is a translation of Re and Apophis by Pritchard's in his solid work The Ancient Near East. Again, here, really good book. Also includes a good translation of the Enuma Elish. As I said, it's written pre-1960s or pre those archaeological finds, and so it lacks some of the more modern understanding we have today. Now, the other flavour of myths, the cattle raiding ones, they appear in the tale of Nera and Dinka from the Sudan, and Masai and the Kikuyu of Eastern Africa. Or within the Bible, there's David and the Philistines from 1 Samuel, chapter 27, verses 8 to 12. And that talks about how all men and women were slaughtered in order that the ox and other animals could be taken. And that list, which I told you, it doesn't even touch on the classics, like Thor and the Midgard serpent, or Hercules and the Hydra, or the Persian Kerisaspa and the horned serpent. Whilst cattle raiding classics including Indra and Panis, or Queen Maeve's quest for the bull of Kuling, or Odysseus' men and Helios's cattle. With so many stories, we must be able to analyse them and discover some common traits, surely. Well, first of all, the obvious. With so many stories, it meant these stories were popular Indo-European themes, common enough amongst our ancestors to be spread so far and wide, to have so many variations that they continue today. However, none of these myths I mentioned go directly back to the Proto Indo Europeans on the Russian steppes, only to cultures that were established post-European migrations, so descendants of the Proto Indo European cultures. So where is this warrior, Trito, in all of this? And more importantly, are stories of him about a victory over a monster or winning back cattle? Well, myths of Trito are clearly attested to in Baltic, Greek, Indian, Iranian, Roman and Slavic cultures today, amongst other European Near Eastern countries. And for this video, we're going to look at these stories that aren't shrouded in controversy and which haven't been historicised, so hopefully haven't lost a significant amount of detail during their telling over the millennia. But first I'll put up a family tree of the development of the myth so we can see how this myth travelled between regions and cultures and the language. And using this chart, and we can see the stories to focus on are on the Indian Trito and Visvarupa myth, the Iranian Theogony and Azidahaka myth, the Armenian Vergil and the Dragon myth, the Greek Heracles and the Geryon myth, and the dependent Roman Hercules and Cacus myth, as well as taking a look back at some Germanic iconography, which tells a story we are interested in. But the best place to start is with the Indo-Iranian stories, and so the first one I'll look at is a passage from the Rig Veda 10.8.8 to 10.8.9. It goes like this. Trita Apcha, knowing the ancestral weapons and impelled by Indra, did battle. Having killed the three-headed, seven-bridled one, Trita drove off the cattle of Tva's own son. The mighty Lord Indra struck down the conceited one who had sought great power, driving forth the cattle of Visvarapa, Tavasta's own son. He ripped off those three heads. And to go with this, we'll now look at the Iranian version and the passage from the Yahst 1523-24. Theogony, the son of the house of Athwa, of the heroic house, sacrificed to Vayu in four-cornered verana, on a golden chair, on a golden pillow, on a golden rug. He strewed the sacred twigs from cupped hands, streaming libations. He asked, "Grant success to me, O Vayu, whose deeds are the highest, that I might be victorious over Azidahaka, the three-moored, three-skulled, six-robed, strong Davic lie, possessed of 1,000 powers, the evil betrayer of mankind, who is the strongest lie created by the evil spirit of Allah Manu against the material world, and to destroy the world of Asa. And may I carry off his two women, Zavanyahavik and Alanavik, who raise themselves up with the most beautiful bodies for the world, who are the most excellent." Both these passages clearly describe the slaying of a monster, a three-headed monster. But whilst they sound similar, What you may not have noticed is that the name of the hero is also the same. The Indian Trito has a more than coincidental similarity with the Persian name Trito Athwa. So, is there meaning behind this name to allow us to understand the reason why a similarly named hero is in both myths? Is there a common root or ancestor here? Now, the first name of the Iranian hero is Trito, and it's a name handed down from a father. It's a patronymic name. From then, the Avestan Thrita, and this is a perfect cognate of the Sanskrit Trita, are both derived from the Proto Indo European Trito, the third. And if we take the Proto Indo European Trito and evolve it through known changes in language evolution, it turns into the Old Norse Tridi, the Latin tertius, Welsh trithid, and Old High German Drito, and so on, all of which literally mean third. Now, the last name of the Indian Trito is probably similarly a family name, but this seems to be specifically a name that can be related to Indo-Iranian heroes. Although such a view isn't wholly accepted, there are some academics who have tried likening that with water. However, there's been much published that demonstrate that this just isn't the case. Now, we can also see that there's been one change in the name which we should try to understand, and that is how Trita became Tritoona, or more specifically, how the name Trita became this patronymic name which actually means son of Trita. Why would this occur? Well, this seems to come down to how Iranian heroes are made, and particularly in the Zoroastrian hymns of the Yahst 9, where to make a hero requires 2 generations. It's a 2-generation affair that involves a ritual. The father-to-be has to prepare a drink, an intoxicating drink made from hurma. The drink is first offered to the gods, and then the father drinks some himself. And this drink goes into the man's body and into, let's call it his seed, such that when he then impregnates a woman, power of his seed is transferred then to his son. And this power has a radiant nimbus, and it's called the Savarena, which sort of envelopes heroes and kings. Now, this is quite a complex and Iranian-specific theory, as within India there's no father-son ritual. The dragons there can just drink soma, the equivalent type of drink to homa, and then be given the power of heroes and kings directly. So, do we know any more about this ritual? Well, we do, and if we look in the Veda 8.12.16 and Yahst 9.10, we see that Trita and Thrita both prepare this drink. And so it makes sense that this Indian version of the myth is actually an earlier version, with the adoption of the son getting power from the father, delivering this generational gap as a later derivative of the story as it evolves. We also need to consider what the drink does. And by that, I mean, does it actually turn you into a god or a demigod, or does it make you, say, just a hero or just a king? Well, there's no evidence that you're changing to a god in the Iranian or Indian mythology. For example, in the Rig Veda 10.48.2, which is another excellent example of a hymn about cattle raiding, it also talks about the use of soma. However, this doesn't mean Trita hasn't turned into a god, but these passages are a result of an independent elevation of the hero, much like Manu and Yumo, to whom he is often grouped. It's Trito's actions that help shape the world and continues as an example for men to look at today. Now, to ensure we understand which myth is the original, we can refer to my earlier suggestion that the Indian Trito is the original figure in the dragon slaying myth. Yeah, and this is supported by sort of numerous scholars, with Indra as a latter addition, a replacement to the myth. And where they both appear in the myth, we can ask, or we may have to ask, is it because Indra had not yet evolved into the god and the power that would eventually supersede Titra, because Indra becomes a god? But there actually is no evidence for this. There's no evidence supporting that Indra takes the myth over. Instead, the myths always seem to show this constant relationship of assistance or dependence between Indra and Trito. In the passage I read, both are given credit for killing the enemy, and Trito is said to have been compelled by Indra, a process that also happens elsewhere in the Rig Veda, in hymn 1048-2, which I mentioned a moment ago. Now, in return, Titra gives Indra Soma, and is said to have drank this intoxicating brew alongside him. In effect, the warrior is offering a ritual sacrifice of Soma to Indra, who in return grants Titra strength. These two are part of the original myth. Titra the dragon slayer, but Indra the god who gave him the power to make it happen. Now, the Iranian evidence is somewhat less conclusive, or if I'm really honest, that's quite generous, it is just inconclusive. The Yahst texts I read above, Thrateona, calls the god Vayu for help. And in parallel passages in the Yahst, he calls other gods, Ardvisura Anarita, or Devaspa, or Asi Vanahi. So there's a clear motive of the hero being aided by a deity, but which of the stories was the original one? And we must also not forget the further complication of the effect of Zarathustra, the impact he had due to the reformation of the myths with his rise, and consequently some of the deities were demoted and others filled their void. So luckily there are other texts which we saw in this family tree which we can look at that may help us on this discovery phase of our journey. And the next one we should look at is the Armenian version of the myth. And this myth comes from the Moses of Corinne, from the History of Armenia, part 131, which is based on a German translation of the text by Lohr. Now, here it says, Tigran's sons were Bab, Tiran, and Vahagan. Of this latter, the fables tell, heaven and earth were in travail. The purple sea was in travail. The red reed had its birth in the seas, and the stems of the reed came forth smoke. From the stems of the reed came forth the flame, and from the flame sprang a young man. This youth had fiery hair, a beard of flame, and his eyes were suns. All sing of this one, I have heard it with my own ears. They thus recount in song along with cymbals his battle with the dragon and his victory. And they sing of him in every way as the heroic deeds of Hercules. This dragon-slaying myth is interesting primarily due to its hero and the name of that hero. You see, even though this is an Armenian story, the name, Vahagan, is not of Armenian origin. Instead, it is a variant of the Indo Iranian warrior god, who was known as Dratakana, now, which is like the smasher of resistance. And as we know, as Vahagan is taken from the Avestan Vathrana, which is Sanskrit Thratan, the story of his birth from a flaming reed is also seen many times in ancient Indian descriptions of important events, and in particular in writings of the re-energization of Indra. What we should also consider is that Vahagan is also a humanization, a myth made into a historical person created within a family descended from a king, and he is said to have had two brothers. He is compared with the hero Hercules, but he isn't a god. Even though his name derives from a warrior god, Vahagan is immortal. There is also another clue about Vahagan, and that is that he is the third child born to Tigran. The first two children have zero importance in the story, no importance other than to make sure that Vahagan is the third born. And with this, he is not only representing the god Tratagna, but also the hero Trito, the third. And so he is representing the role of the god and the hero who originally cooperated in the dragon slayer myth. These two figures now evolved and merged into one figure, a hero, but who bears the name of the god. Now, as the dragon slayer myth evolved and this fusion of the hero and god happened, so other details of the myth changed or disappeared. And in this Armenian version, we see this in the dragon that Trito fights. This dragon has lost some of the properties of the earlier myths, things that have been very specific in earlier versions of the myth. So we can find these by looking at what the Indo Iranian sources say in their descriptions and comparing. The dragon of the Armenian is described as a serpent. So in the Rig Veda 1048.2 we have the Sanskrit Ahi, which is Avestan Azi of the Yahst 1523, and both of these derive from the Proto Indo European Ingui. And this word then evolves through reflexes to the Latin anguis, which is what we'd eventually see as eel or water serpent. The other details lost include that which says the serpent has 3 heads. And we know this as the 3 heads are implied within the Avestan Trikemnidan or the Sanskrit Trisur Sanmanam. And then there is the fact that the other stories tell the serpent inhabited lands long before time when these new cultures settled, and that the serpent wants to cause harm to them without provocation. And this can be seen in the Iranian name Azi Dahaka, mentioned in the Yahst story earlier. This carries the ka suffix in their name, a suffix that suggests that when used, that person is not liked. No one likes them if they've got that suffix. And this is also seen in the Rig Veda 1099.6 and 1.1584, where the monster is described as Dsa, a word reflecting Aboriginal origin, as in it was originally there before people settled, and this monster has a willingness to harm people. There is one other piece of information as well that's still missing in the Armenian story, and that is the prize. What was won when the dragon was defeated? Typically, dragon slayer myths have a princess to be rescued, but in the Armenian myth, nothing is given. And if we look at the Indian and Iranian sources, then we can see some ambiguity, with the stories showing that cattle were being returned, or in the analysis from Lizend Avesta by James Domestitor, we see that the women taken from Yima by Azidahaka were won back by Thraiteona. And this last version plot probably more aligns to what would be what we assume is the original story, what it would contain. And as an aside, if you're interested in the Zend Avesta, there are many copies in the public domain, so it's quite easy to find a PDF of it for free if you want to read the story yourself. It's quite large. But back to the prize. And whilst we can make both cattle as women as being obtained from the victory from these myths, by slaying the dragon you win either of these, many academics see these purely as metaphors about natural phenomena, specifically storms or the seasonal freeing of waters. So with this perception of the myth, it makes it more of an allegory, with Thratkahana and Titra being identified as a storm, with the serpent Ingui with the clouds, and cows and women the rain. And whilst this allegory may fit with cultures telling the story as it evolved, it really feels unlikely that this was the original meaning. So there must be another way to look at what these myths could mean or represent. And there is, and that is by looking at the words used to describe the prize. And with the Avestan, the actual term used within the text is Vanta. And in an analysis by James Domestitor, he briefly notes that this means female who is desired. There's actually no reference to a human woman specifically, it's just a female. So this could be applied to anything female. So rather than a woman, this could be applied to female cattle, the cow. And if we look then at the Indo-Iranian term, which is similar to this, and it's the Aeneid, a frequently used word for cow, this actually doesn't mean cow, it means she who lactates and gives milk. So this too could be applied to either a female human or a cow, in fact, any female mammal. But within the Rig Veda 539, a parallel term, De'ena, which is usually translated as meaning cows, here is actually used to describe 2 women captured by enemies. And so if we pull this together, we can see the historical evolution of the myth the story would recognise as a knight slaying a dragon to rescue a princess, actually comes from a fight between a hero and a three-headed monster to rescue kidnapped queens. And that myth we read actually has originally come underneath that from a hero slaying a serpent to recover cattle, feed cows. So why was the original story lost, this cow story? And partly to blame is the scholars who originally tackled the Greek myths on dragon slaying. As I sort of hinted at early, they were nature. They believed they were nature-driven allegory, and by doing this, you lose the sense of the myth. And if we look back now, some of these Greek myths and ignore that allegory and look at the original story, it becomes absolutely clear and totally unambiguous that these myths were about rescuing cattle. And so to prove this, let's do this. We can start by looking at Hesoid's Theogony. In this book, there's a story involving Heracles, which involves a passage that goes along the lines of this. And Chrysa killed the three-headed Geryon. After marrying Calliroe, Ocean's daughter, the mighty Heracles stripped him of life and limb. By his shambling cattle on the sea-encircled Erythea, he drove those broad-faced cattle away to holy Tiryns, crossing the ford of Ocean and killing Orthos and the herdsman Urtian in that hazy stead beyond the glorious ocean. There's no ambiguity here about cattle being the prize in that fight. And also, in Propertius Elegies, there's a similar story which ends, Alcides spoke thus, Go, you cattle, go, you cattle of Hercules, the last labour of our club, twice sought by me and twice my booty, you cattle, sanctify the fields and cattle, place with your long lowing, the forum of noble Rome will be your pasture. Now we mustn't forget that many Roman myths were based on the Greek myths, and so they weren't necessarily independent of influence, but Hesoid's myth seems to be independent, and we can tell this by examining some of the details. In this version, Heracles is a third opponent to face Geryon, and Geryon, who is the original cattle thief, stole the cattle in an earlier encounter, and this aligns directly with the story of Azidahaka, who stole two women from Yima before Theogony recovered them. And this thirdness is still seen within the Roman myths too. There is a strong possibility that the hero of these myths was also originally not Heracles, but third, and that's based on the Greek, which was written in some versions, which was Tritos. But please understand, I'm not saying that Heracles is a direct representation of the third, the original warrior here. Heracles is a lot more complex than that. But the original slayer of Geryon in this myth was almost certainly called third, aligning this myth to the Proto Indo European hero. And that Heracles was a popular Greek hero who was applied to that myth because of his similarities in his perception as being a hero. Now, the Roman myths I touched on, in effect the Hercules Cacus story, they have evolved from Heracles Geryon stories, and these two have also managed to keep some features such as a link to the original hero's name, the third. And this is evidence in Propertius Elegies 4.9.15, a Cacus being hit by a club 3 times. Within Ovid Fasti 1.575, Hercules' club, which is used to kill Cacus, has 3 nodes, and in Vergil's epic Aeneid 8.2.30, Hercules runs around the mountain where Cacus lives in a cave 3 times before sitting down to rest 3 times before he goes into the cave. And 3 comes into play in all these stories, but all in a different way. And these sources therefore aren't influencing each other, yet they're all very specific about this detail of 3, and we can feel confident in this because at the end of mentioning the third thing in these stories, Cacus is then slayed. The monster is killed. The mention of the third thing has a direct impact on the death of the monster. There are other details within these myths that also hint at Proto Indo European origins, such as the monsters are three-headed, they are serpents. And we know this because it's documented that Geryon is a grandchild of Medusa, and Cacus was identified as an aborigine from a different culture. And all this is wrapped up in a story where Cacus stole the cattle first, and so Hercules is seeking revenge. The aborigine is the aggressor. But where the Greco-Roman myths seem to differ is the role of the god that helps the hero. In the Indo-Iranian story, the gods of Indra and Dhritarashtra were instrumental in allowing the victory of Trito, and the hero made sure to give Soma to the god before battle, as to give strength to the god allows the god then to give the warrior strength. But in the Greco-Roman myths, there is no god, no sacrifice of Soma or an equivalent drink given. And this lack of drink given to the gods is actually common throughout the European descendants of the original myth. Even the Germanic versions of the myth do not contain this ritual or the god, although there is an equivalent form of Soma which exists within the Old Norse, which is known as the mead of poetry. And if you're interested in that, I'll talk about that specifically in a video I'll link here. However, the scholar Bruce Lincoln, who wrote a good paper on the cattle raiding myth, which I'll link below, which some of this information has come from, has shown a reference to this story, this cattle raiding myth, is engraved to a golden horn of Galleus. And that's dated around 5th century CE. And it's his belief that until now, or until he wrote this paper, that myth hadn't been recognised. I'll put a picture up of the engraving of the horn now, and I'll walk you through it. So, in this picture, there is a three-headed man carrying a weapon, an axe or hammer in one hand, and with the other hand he is leading an animal. To his side are three serpents laying dead. And looking as a whole, even Lincoln admits the interpretation of this is challenging. Is it the humanoid with an axe? Is that Trito? Or is this a representation of the three serpents? No one can really be sure at the moment exactly what is being captured specifically, but it's certain that this is a representation of a myth as a whole from a Germanic source, and it contains themes of the third, serpent enemies, and the taking of livestock. It seems likely that this is a representation of the myth, as would make sense to Germanic tribes that had a creation myth that we know descended from the Proto Indo European myth. And so, with all this, we can come to the point where we should be able to reconstruct the outline myth which our Proto Indo European ancestors had, which is there was a hero called Trito, meaning third, who suffered at the hands of a monstrous figure, a three-headed serpent, who was identified as belonging to an aboriginal culture within the lands where the Proto Indo Europeans were living. And in the first encounter, the serpent stole some cattle which belonged to the hero's kingdom. But in the second meeting, the hero made an offering to the gods of Soma, and in return was given strength. And this strength allowed him to slay the serpent and recover the cattle. And with our knowledge of this myth, we can try and consider what was the reasoning behind the myth. What is its meaning? What is its purpose? As I mentioned earlier, many scholars consider it an allegory of nature and storms, or a tale of victory over death. Maybe even a conflict of realms, the serpent from below and the hero from the heavens, or a battle of your mind's own demons. But we have also thrown doubt onto all these, and so what if it means more than these? And we touched on the fact that the myth is both a dragon slaying myth and a cattle raiding myth, and the dragon representing outsiders, the aboriginals, people who were not considered part of the Indo-European cultures. And what is interesting is that the three-headed god is a major figure in pre-Indo-European cultures of India and the Mediterranean, but it was never a god in the Indo-European cultures. So, is the dragon slaying a motif aligning to the Indo-Europeans' victory over other Indo-Mediterraneans. Dumezil again argued that part of the young warrior initiation could have involved combat with a mock triple-headed monster, reenacting this primordial myth, allowing them to become Trito and remembering the old Indo-European victories. The cattle raiding myth could also be considered in similar ways, especially considering the importance of cattle for the Indo-Europeans. They were a cornerstone of the economy. They were so useful to peoples at the time. This is indicated by the cow turning up in the creation myth. The animal's leather, the bones, the urine, the milk, the meat. We must not forget that the society at the time was built in texts of, in the stories of men and cattle, of bipeds and quadrupeds. These all terms used in myths. The retention of cattle and indeed the acquisition of further cattle would have been of the utmost importance to the tribes and cultures of the Proto Indo Europeans. The prayers of their ancestors are filled with requests for cattle, so cattle raiding would have been one of the main jobs of the warriors, and as such myths and stories were told about this task. We see history reflects this, from Helios's cattle theft in Homer's The Odyssey, to Tainbo of the Old Irish, to the Armenian St. George's annual cattle theft. The many mentions in the Rig Veda, for example, in 110.6, 331.4, 353.9, 661. There are some, and the famous Battle of the Ten Kings in the Rig Veda 783.1. That's also seen to be a cattle raid. This Trito myth tells of the most important raid, though. It tells of the first raid, and as such, it is the prototype story for the rest, defining the rituals, defining the invocation of the warrior god for strength, pouring libations and drinking the intoxicating soma. Again, the Rig Veda has many texts with warriors associating themselves with Trito in 211.19, 986.20 and 586.1, as some, and in the Iranian text of Yahst 1992. And Thria is seen as the name of General Xerxes in Herodotus 782. But there's also ethics in this myth. Trito did not just raid for cattle. He was provoked into raiding by having his cattle stolen. Therefore, there is a justification in these actions, in these raids, in the battle. Openly attacking an enemy who stole cattle, probably in a despicable way, maybe by stealth. The myth needs a rationale, and that is the rationale behind it. Here it is. It's retribution, in effect. But let's not lose sight of where we began, with man and his twin, Manus and Emo, and the myth of Trito the third. This myth is actually grouped with the creation myth with Manus and Emo. Manus and Emo represent the sovereign function, defining a king and priests. The myth of Trito serves as the warrior, establishing the role of all capable men. Now, perhaps one day we'll find there's a myth for those who couldn't be kings, priests or warriors. But that is still hidden from us, for now anyway. Perhaps the role is too poorly defined or related for us to be able to spot this myth, or perhaps the role was considered too low to even deserve a myth. But for us and this story, the Dragon Slayer comes from a battle our ancestors had in raiding stolen cattle from their enemies. The dragon being a representation of those enemies who were considered unpleasant and alien. And the princesses of today's stories were cows that were valuable back then. And so, before I go, I want to just add that for those who aren't familiar with my videos, the creation myth references I often discuss are based on scholarly works, including books by David Anthony and Bruce Lincoln. And whilst there are challenges and critiques of these that can be applied to the work, I feel there is enough commentary around this to use them as good sources for these videos, and I'll put references to all these in the descriptions below. And so now I must come to the end of the video and say thank you for all who made it here. I hope you found it interesting, and if you did and you enjoyed the research, please hit the like button, as it means this video will hopefully be seen by even more people on YouTube, and that can only be a good thing. as a side note, with universities opening back up again, I'm going to have less time to make videos, so these are going to probably be less frequent. I won't stop the channel, which I did ponder for a second, but no, I will continue, but probably every fortnight or every month I'll do a solid video rather than try and squeeze out a really small one every week because of the time. So hope you all understand. Hope you enjoyed that. Please, any questions or comments, as always, leave them below and I'll answer them as I always do. And so until the next video, please stay safe and stay well. And this was Krakenford.